I tend to define the survival horror genre by the term set by the game that established the genre to the mainstream, Resident Evil 1 from 1996. It's not that the systems of that game had never existed before. Survival games existed, horror games existed, we had games where you explored large maps solving puzzles, but Resident Evil had a very special way of putting it all together. It drew from older titles like Sweet Home and Alone in the Dark, but it was Resident Evil that brought us the term survival horror, giving a name to this unique combination of ideas and introducing large parts of the world to these concepts. So what are the foundations of Resident Evil's gameplay, and by extension the survival horror genre? Limited inventory space, limited resources, puzzle solving, whether item-based, logic-based, or riddle-based, exploration, backtracking, map reliance, enemy avoidance, hard saves with a limited amount, and an overall heavy emphasis on decision-making. It's important to have combat in a survival horror game, but it's even more important to have reasons not to engage in it. In addition to that, we have the presentation, fixed camera, pre-rendered backgrounds, tank controls, creepy yet beautiful soundtrack. To me, these are more flexible. Having these things certainly helps a game capture a classic authenticity, but I don't think they're all necessary for a true survival horror experience. An example that comes to mind is Cry of Fear, a game that's entirely in first person, but follows the gameplay principles to a high degree. Silent Hill has a crane-like camera that mainly sits behind you, but at times it moves cinematically, which gives the game its unique feel. Some rooms are presented in fixed camera angles that go on to track your movements. I think you can change the visual presentation of the game and still remain in the survival horror genre. Another game to mention is Outlast, a game often labeled as survival horror, when it's missing many defining aspects of the genre. I don't think it has enough of them to earn the title. No inventory, no weapons, so there's no decisions on confronting enemies or not, a real lack of interesting puzzles. Most of the game is hiding and sneaking around with some running sequences. Instead, it should be classified as a stealth horror game. A game like Darkwood, to me, feels more like a straight-up survival game than specifically survival horror, with its focus on scavenging, trap setting, lots of crafting, but then it's also very horrific. Honestly, I don't know Darkwood well enough to say definitively if it's survival horror or not, but it does show that there is a discussion to be had here. I'm not going to say that everything Resident Evil did has to be replicated for your game to be considered survival horror though. Resident Evil had boss fights, but that doesn't mean you have to have boss fights to be a survival horror game. Resident Evil has magic chests that let you transfer items across maps, but I don't think you need that if you're making your own survival horror game. This genre has many aspects that defined it in the years of its popularization, and other titles have gone on to be called survival horror as they continued to bend the rules. Silent Hill is widely considered to be one of the best survival horror franchises of all time, but it breaks a couple key rules established by Resident Evil: limited inventory and limited saves. In Silent Hill, you can carry everything you find, and use save points as many times as you want. Do these two things disqualify it from the genre of survival horror? I think it's a legitimate question, especially since limited inventories are a staple of survival games in general, scary or not. But when you look at the core gameplay of Silent Hill and how it flows very similarly to Resident Evil, and how strongly it emphasizes other important aspects of the game, namely the exploration, backtracking, map reliance, puzzle solving, enemy avoidance, and hard saves without checkpoints, it's easy to say that, yeah, Silent Hill falls under the general umbrella of survival horror established by Resident Evil. Much like how Street Fighter II is really the first true fighting game, creating the arcade fighter craze, even though there were other fighting games before it dating back to the 70s. Street Fighter II set forth a series of principles that are still being followed today, but obviously not every fighting game plays identical to Street Fighter. Back to block and cross-ups are fundamental to Street Fighter's gameplay, but having a block button instead in Mortal Kombat or 3D fighters like Soul Calibur doesn't mean they don't deserve the title of fighting game. Back to survival horror. Starting with a stronger shift to an action focus with Resident Evil 4, the term survival horror started to get more and more confused. People used it to describe anything scary that you had to survive. We're calling RE4 survival horror, we're calling Deadspace survival horror, I even hear Doom 3 referred to as survival horror. A flashlight in the dark does not turn Doom into a survival horror game. It's a first-person shooter, it just happens to emphasize horror. RE4 established the action horror genre. It is not and never has been a survival horror game. On top of having an inventory that's way too big for the survival horror genre, there's simply too much of an emphasis on action. You shouldn't want to kill everything in a survival horror game the first time you play it. Really, you shouldn't even be able to. It's crucial to the experience that you're backtracking through areas and passing through dangerous groups of enemies, having to make the decision of whether you'll kill them now and make it safe, or hold on to that precious ammo and take the risk of trying to get around them. When you have so many guns and so much inventory space and so much ammo, and the enemies drop even more ammo and healing supplies for you, you've crossed from survival horror to action horror. And that's okay, Resident Evil 4 and Dead Space are great games that I love. It's not an insult to say they aren't survival horror. I'm just saying you shouldn't be calling your game survival horror if the game plan on your first playthrough is to confront swarms of enemies in every room and annihilate them while picking up even more goodies and resources from their corpses. In Dead Space, depending on your difficulty level and your aim, you may have moments when you're pretty low on ammo, though I'm not sure if that makes the whole game experience authentically survival horror. It's very combat heavy, the inventory is huge, you're not solving puzzles, and there's certainly no real exploration since you have a waypoint that shows you where to go. There's a point to explore about the story as well. Classic survival horror games had certain ways of delivering story, through occasional cutscenes and through notes, diaries, and historical records scattered throughout the game. Story and character moments are focused and spread out after long periods of adventure, allowing the player to learn about the world at their own pace if they'd like to. But I certainly wouldn't say a certain type of story has to be told, especially given how vastly different the stories are between the two most iconic survival horror titles, Resident Evil and Silent Hill, one being about biological experiments and the other being magic-based and psychological. I'd like to share a clip from an excellent video called What is Survival Horror from the channel Mild Conviction. Check out the link to his channel below. In this clip, he talks about the inspiration of Sweet Home on the first Resident Evil, and where Resident Evil differentiates itself to establish the survival horror genre.
A lot of this gameplay probably sounds familiar, and it should, because most of it would be brought over to what was originally intended to be Sweet Home's remake, Resident Evil. Released in 1996 on the PlayStation 1, Resident Evil was produced by Sweet Home's director, Tokuro Fujiwara, and directed by his pupil, Shinji Mikami. The amount of mechanics and details it adopted from its source of inspiration was massive. The mansion setting, puzzles, inventory management, storytelling through notes, picking and choosing which enemies to fight and which to run from, a Metroidvania-like map with lots of backtracking, multiple endings based on how many characters survive, and much, much more. The big difference, however, was combat. Resident Evil obviously did not end up being a turn-based RPG. In its prototype phase, it was actually going to be a first-person shooter. But according to Mikami himself, another horror game, Alone in the Dark, convinced him to instead adopt a static third-person camera, which allowed the Capcom team to create detailed, pre-rendered backgrounds that could be utilized in place of low-resolution and primitive-looking 3D environmental models, which, in turn, obviously also meant the implementation of tank controls.
I really recommend watching that video, it goes into much more detail than I could. At the end of the day, I guess it's gonna come down to how individuals feel about the genre anyway. You can hold up any number of horror games and say, is this true survival horror? Or is it just horror with a few survival aspects? Or is it action horror with a few survival aspects? Can you look at a game like Sweet Home and say it absolutely qualifies as survival horror, even though we weren't even using that term yet? I suppose that would be fine. But survival horror is largely going to be judged based on the game that popularized it. There were first-person shooters before Wolfenstein 3D, but you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who's gonna credit Battlezone for establishing the first-person shooter genre. Yay, I did it, I mentioned Battlezone twice in a month. I guess that's not really fair, since Battlezone and other first-person games didn't establish nearly as many mechanics as Sweet Home did before the coining of the term survival horror. But you know what I'm saying. Resident Evil is the one that mixed all the ingredients in the right way with other ingredients, and was able to present itself in the right artistic fashion to really sell the concept. If you disagree with how I'm defining survival horror, and you want to tell me that Deadspace and RE4 really are survival horror and I should be more respectful of differing views on the subject, well, I invite you to imagine a big old, in my opinion, before everything I said. If you're looking to recapture that classic 1996 Resident Evil survival horror experience, I'm gonna recommend checking out Alisa. It's available on PC right now, and it's made as a love letter to the classics of the genre. Sometimes people ask me what kind of game I would make if I went into game development, and my answer would be something like this, a classic survival horror experience. Alisa is quite an achievement for first-time developer Casper Crows. He's really captured the essence of those first games in the 90s. It's not perfect, we'll get into that, but the presentation and general gameplay hit it out of the park. Alisa nails a lot of the most important aspects of the survival horror genre, and I'm certainly recommending it. However, I will be providing some feedback here and critiquing aspects of it which will hopefully be received positively because I really like this game for the most part. Alisa has a very old look to it, like a PlayStation 1 game, but even more crude. It runs at a very low resolution too. The entire game is presented in fixed camera angles and pre-rendered backgrounds. I can't imagine how much time it took to make every one of them. They work really well with classic tank controls, which are definitely recommended. The atmosphere is immersive, interesting, and changing. The hallway captures that Resident Evil 1 mansion feel like no game I've seen in 25 years. You find yourself in underground dungeons, courtyards, circus tents, and plenty of other suitably creepy environments. Your character is Alisa, and she's part of a team looking for a man who stole the Emperor's blueprints. While pursuing him, you get sucked down into the ground by monsters. When you wake up, you find yourself trapped in a place called the Dollhouse, surviving all kinds of monstrosities that look like deformed toys. You're a special agent that's been kidnapped, and you awaken to find yourself dressed in a doll outfit. You can later change this outfit in save rooms. There's a large emphasis on puzzle solving, even more so than the original Resident Evil. Many areas are locked off and you have to find keys. Using a key on a door requires you to open the inventory and select the right key, which for an old PlayStation 1 survival horror player like myself makes me very happy. Puzzles mainly involve collecting information and using a key item and then solving some kind of riddle, or taking an answer found in one room and using it somewhere else. If you're not in the mood for puzzles, you shouldn't be playing a classic survival horror game in the first place. Puzzle variety is, I think, one of Alisa's biggest strengths. Sometimes games with puzzles tend to have a lot of the same kinds of puzzles. Resident Evil 2 is mostly item-based. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis has some puzzles I like, but they're mostly all about flipping the switches in the right order to hit some target value, or arranging figures in the right order to complete a sequence. And Silent Hill puzzles are usually about either finding the right items or solving a riddle. Alisa has a little bit of everything. It's got the riddles, it's got the sequence puzzles, it's got timed physical puzzles, maze-like areas where you gotta open the right doors, combination locks. It's always keeping things fresh. Except the slide puzzle. I cannot comprehend how anyone could put a slide puzzle in their game, much less as the first puzzle you encounter. I can't do these things. I've never been able to do these things. They aren't based in items, logic, or riddles. It's like solving a Rubik's Cube. That kind of puzzle does not belong in a survival horror game. People hate them. I hate them. I only solve them by luck. I couldn't do it in RE4, I couldn't do it in Silent Hill Homecoming, and I can't do it here. When I play a game with puzzles and exploration, and I'm having a good time for hours, I come across a slide puzzle, and it's just like, okay, stop having fun now. I'll turn the game off at that point, I don't care, they aren't fun. I solved it by accident the first time, and on repeat playthroughs I just got stuck here moving around cubes, and it really sucks. I shouldn't have to go on YouTube every time I play this game to watch someone solve a slide puzzle and then copy it just so I don't have to spend another 10 minutes fiddling with this thing. It should be removed entirely. Disagree with me all you want in the comments, I'm standing by this. Slide puzzles suck and completely kill a game's flow. Keep them out. Moving on. Some puzzles are needlessly confusing, like the chemical puzzle, because it tells you that you need to pick up chemicals on the top floor where you are, but the chemicals in the room with the note can't be picked up. But then after you leave and you kill the boss, now you can pick up the chemicals in that room. That's confusing for no good reason. You should be able to pick up the chemical immediately upon discovering it. The locations of Alisa are unnerving and unwelcoming. They aren't exactly labyrinthian, but you will be checking your map quite frequently to figure out where you want to be going. Enemies do a hefty amount of damage to you and are best avoided when possible, which is usually. Alisa contains a few terrifying moments that got a good scare out of me, but I wish it contained a little more of that Silent Hill style dread where you really don't want to open the next door. Inventory space limits you to 2 weapons, but you can hold all the items you want, including keys, ammo, health kits, and puzzle items. This is probably the furthest the game strays from the classic survival horror formula, but since there is a 2-weapon limit, you don't feel unstoppable. And ammo and healing items are so sparse that a limited inventory probably wouldn't have that much of an effect on the gameplay. Killing enemies drops a handful of tooth wheels, which can be used at save points to buy supplies. Tooth wheels can also be found throughout the map. Initially, I was very concerned about tooth wheels being earned from killing enemies. As I stated earlier, if the game is incentivizing you to kill every enemy you see through rewards that give you even more ammo, you're leaving the survival horror genre. Fortunately, the amount of ammo it takes to kill enemies certainly outweighs the amount of credits gained. Ammo and health kits are expensive, as are new weapons, and saving costs a tooth wheel every time. So I think there's a pretty good balance that lets Alisa feel like its own thing while still sitting firmly in the survival horror genre. I never felt like I was sitting comfortably on a bunch of resources. I regularly had no health kits and just a little bit of ammo to get by. Boss fights sometimes came down to the final bullet. Alisa really does walk a very thin line between survival horror and action horror design when it comes to combat. You are being rewarded for combat, which goes against a crucial survival horror principle, but the stretch of those rewards is so limited that it ends up feeling as strict as it would if you were playing Resident Evil and were only finding items in the environment. New weapons are incredibly expensive. You'll be needing to buy multiple health items, so you're not going to be flooded with ammo. And unlike the store in a game like Deadspace, where you can buy as much ammo and health as you want if you have enough credits, Alisa limits the number of items available for purchase at any time. Early game enemies may fall easily, but later game enemies are much tankier and deadlier, and it makes the rewards you get from killing them feel not worth the risk or resources. So, like I said, it really walks that line. It's at a point where I'd say it's limited enough to still fall on the survival horror side, but it's close. Speaking of boss fights, survival horror aficionado The Sphere Hunter has a cameo as one of the bosses, Isabel Flora. How cool is that? The voice acting in this game is awkward, but I honestly don't care because the classic survival horror games had some of the worst voice acting of its time. So for me, having weird stilted dialogue adds to the charm and complements the old graphic style of the game.
Hey, come over here. Open this door. You're under arrest.
I'll go first. Proceed with your own judgment. All right? Can you do it?
Yes, I can!
Good luck.
The phones are all dead, and the radio too. I'm going back to call in some reinforcements.
The boss fights themselves are quite poor, which is to be expected from a game with such limited controls. I found the first fight with Pierre Edmiston to be a miserable experience. Very frustrating with the way the camera presents this fight. I may have actually preferred to have no boss fights at all in this game because they just aren't any fun. Boss fights unfortunately appear sometimes at the end of a long section where you haven't been given the opportunity to save your game, which is definitely a mistake. I'm not asking for checkpoints, but if you look at the classics like Resident Evil and Silent Hill, there's either an option to save right before a boss, or you have a good foreboding sense that a boss fight is approaching, so you'll run and save before opening that door you've been trying to open for the past 2 hours. In Alisa, you might spend 20 minutes getting through a maze or puzzle section just to suddenly walk into a boss fight that you can't run from. You'll die and then you gotta do it all over again. Pretty weak. It's very refreshing to be back in a fixed camera tank control game again, but sometimes the camera changes can be disorienting. In a fixed camera game, it's important for you to be able to hold up and let the perspective change while still preserving a sense of direction and understanding of the space. Like in Resident Evil 1, I can hold up to run straight and still have a good understanding of where I'm going as the camera changes. Sometimes in Alisa, the camera changes and I have no idea where I am or where I'm going anymore. I suppose that's a consequence of this being made by one guy. It's not all gonna work. Despite the intentions of Alisa feeling like a throwback to classic survival horror, I think it still could have done with a few modern quality of life features. There's no archive for the notes you found, so you gotta run back to each room if you want to read something. That's really tedious considering some of them contain puzzle solutions. The map should be able to zoom in further, and it should mark locked doors with the keys necessary to unlock them. There's really no reason not to. Without it, you end up running up to several doors because you don't remember which one goes with the I key or whatever. The map should also mark important locations like it does in Silent Hill. Your character would circle points of interest so you knew where to go back to. Alisa needs that. Combat in Alisa is not good. And I know the joke, well, weren't those old games really terrible in combat too, so that makes sense. Well, the combat in Resident Evil 1 and the Silent Hill games wasn't good either, sure. You don't want to have a character that's great at combat because these are not supposed to be action games. If you have really fluid combat controls and lots of options, then the game has to raise the action level to compensate. When that happens, you get RE4. So I approve of keeping the combat and movement limited, but somehow it's much worse than it was even in Resident Evil 1. It doesn't just feel limited, it feels bad and unresponsive. Enemies can be quite mobile sometimes, and there's no lock-on targeting system like pretty much every classic game eventually ended up offering, and most importantly, the angled shots are totally fucked. When you're aiming at an enemy, a little indicator will light up to show you that your shot will make contact. It's not very forgiving at all. Way too precise. If you look at Resident Evil, due to the limited controls, the game was very forgiving with your accuracy. Your shots could go pretty wide and still hit the target, because it's not a combat game where you need to be a crack shot. In Alisa, you're being asked to aim your shots like a modern game with old clunky tank controls, and it just doesn't work. It's so easy to miss your shots. But what's worse is that when enemies are on the ground, you have to angle your shot downwards at the perfect angle while they're scurrying around the floor. It's not just a simple downward angle. You have to tap the D-pad to get the angle just right. It's insanely frustrating. Look at how Resident Evil handled this. You only needed to aim down if you knocked down an enemy and want to shoot them before they get up, or if someone was crawling at you. Dogs, or even lickers in some cases, even though they're low to the ground, can still be hit just fine with a straight shot. This is how it should have been in Alisa. The aiming controls are so frustrating that I end up running away from enemies, not purely out of a strategic desire to preserve resources, but because I know I'm gonna fuck up the angle on the aim and get hit and waste more ammo than I would need to by missing half my shots. If you think fixing the aiming system would lead to you having too many resources, well, rebalance the resources. I played Alisa in chunks, largely due to the fact that it launched with a lot of issues. Several puzzles were broken and left you unable to continue. It sucked. One of them took several months to fix before I could progress. But you know, first-time developer, one guy making this game, I'm much more forgiving of that than I am a major studio. And he's been consistent with updates to make the game a better experience. Minor spoilers for the next section, skip ahead if you don't want to hear them. The story is probably where Alisa is lacking the most. I didn't get much of an understanding of what this place was, how it worked, who my character was, why it was her that ended up here, what was up with the blueprints that were stolen at the beginning of the game, what's the truth about the Emperor. There aren't enough lore pages sprinkled throughout the game, and there just isn't much resolution. The ending left me feeling pretty disappointed because I didn't have any concept of who I was fighting or why or what this was all about. There's been some interesting things to find on repeat playthroughs, and that's very much appreciated. Decisions that can affect what happens in boss fights. I like that there's secret items to be found, like a crossbow if you find how to use the rope. That kind of stuff made it more interesting as I was replaying the game to get footage for this video. Despite my misgivings with the story and the other issues I mentioned, Alisa ended up being one of my favorite games of 2021, and I'm fully admitting that it's based on nostalgia. If you didn't grow up enjoying the survival horror classics of the PlayStation 1, you're not gonna like this nearly as much as I did. And that's okay. In some aspects, Alisa really suffers. Unresponsive controls, aiming, pretty unimpressive enemy encounters and boss fights, story. But what makes me love it so much is how it nails so many important aspects of classic survival horror design. Mood, resource management, inventory, saves, map design, backtracking, puzzle variation, camera, art style, music. I just don't get to play a game like this very often, and I'm happy I got to. I'm recommending this game to anybody who is looking for something to scratch that itch. The RE2 remake did a really good job of modernizing survival horror, but it just doesn't have that classic feel. Fixed camera angle, tank controls, not feeling powerful. I hope Casper improves on this game and makes more, because we need more people who really get it to make survival horror titles. Thanks for watching, see you next time.